Hello, I'm Stuart Price, Product Owner for iTrent Payroll and Workforce Management. With me today is Neil Tonks, MHR's Legislation Manager. Hi Neil, and so it feels like another week passes, another government announcement, and another set of rules. What can you tell us about yesterday's announcement, and do we yet have enough information to be able to act and produce software?
Well, actually, Stuart, a few things have changed during this week, so there's finally been some movement. The major change was on Wednesday, of course. The Chancellor announced that the job support scheme will now have two flavours, so it's changed significantly before it even came into effect. So the new versions are going to be called JSS Open and JSS Closed. That's the names they're given in the documentation. The open and closed refers to whether or not the employer has been required to close the premises due to lockdown requirements. So in effect, JSS Open is the scheme announced last month and JSS Closed is a new one. Under the JSS Closed scheme, the government will pay 67%, two-thirds, of the reference salary of affected employees. These are people who can't work at all because their employer has been required to close by the government of one of the countries that make up the UK. There'll be a maximum of £2,083.33 a month on this payment, although the employer could pay more than that if they wished out of their own pocket. So that's a new scheme, which we know relatively little about at the moment because it's only just been announced. But the Chancellor also announced significant changes to the JSS Open scheme, the original one. The contribution to the pay for unworked hours which the employer has to make will now be only 5% as opposed to the original 33%. And people will need to work at least 20% of their reference hours rather than the 33% originally announced. So that's a significant reduction for both the hours and the employee contribution. Additionally, the employer will be allowed to pay a top-up to the employees if they wish. The original government guidance suggested this wouldn't be allowed, which I always thought was a bit strange because governments aren't usually in the business of telling employers what they can't pay people. But it's been clarified that they will be allowed to pay a top-up if they want. The other positive development we have is that we do now finally have more details of the actual calculations, particularly where the JSS Open scheme is concerned. This came in a policy paper which was published late yesterday, that's the 22nd of October. It gives us some welcome information about the calculations, although we still don't have the whole picture. So the JSS Open scheme now works like this. The employee works 20% or more of their normal hours and is paid for those at the normal rate. For the hours not worked, the employer pays 5% up to a maximum of £125 a month, and the government contributes 61.67% up to a maximum of £1,541.75 a month. Very precise figures here. So that's 66.67% overall, two-thirds. The cap is reduced if the employee works more than 20% of their normal hours, though we don't know the formula required to do that yet. Like a number of other things, it's promised at the end of October. The overall effect of the scheme is the employee receives at least 73% of their normal income and more if they work hours in excess of the 20% minimum or their employer decides to pay more than the minimum. As with the previous schemes, the income is subject to tax, NI and pension, and the employer needs to pay their share of NI and pension. The government won't fund those, but that's the same as with the current furlough scheme at the moment. There's a new definition of the reference salary and of the normal hours used to work out how many unworked hours there are. For variable paid employees, these calculations now have three components. The values used are the higher of, the value from the same calendar period in 2019-20 tax year, the average over the 2019-20 tax year, and the average over the period from the 1st of February 2020 to the 23rd of September. The first two of those are the same as those used in the previous scheme, so the last one's new, and presumably it's there because the scheme can be used for new employees, and calculations based on last year would of course return zero for them. For people on fixed hours and pay, the new scheme uses the greater of the value from the last pay period ending on or before the 19th of March 2020 and the value from the last pay period ending on or before the 23rd of September 2020. Again, the second of those is new compared to the previous furlough scheme, and presumably it's there to provide a value for people who weren't employed on the 19th of March. As before, all those calculations are done on a calendar day basis, not work days. Intriguingly, the document says that if the employee has moved to part-time working, the hours calculation may be varied, and says details of this will be contained in the forthcoming guidance at the end of October. So we don't know what the thinking is with this. The document also says you need to ignore hours paid as part of a flexi-time arrangement, which is very curious. I don't know why they've done this. I also don't know how it's going to work in practice, because those hours will often be impossible to identify from the payroll records. Payrolls tend to just record the hours that people have worked, not why they work them. So that's the open scheme. There aren't any real details of the calculations for the closed scheme. The document says these details will be in the guidance at the end of October, which is a bit late and means that software to fully support the scheme won't be available for its start date of the 1st of November. We ought to be able to assume that things like the calculation of the reference salary and working hours will be the same for both of the schemes. However, the document we have is at pains to point out that calculations for the closed scheme will be available in the end of October guidance, so we can't be sure of this. I can't see any reason why the two schemes would use different calculations, though, so maybe that's just the authors being overcautious because they've not been given any official guidance on how that other scheme will work. The payments, whichever scheme they're using, need to be made by the employers in the normal payment cycle, just as with the current furlough scheme. The government contribution is then reclaimed later, monthly in arrears. There aren't any further details of the reclaim portal yet, though it won't open till the 8th of December, so it's perhaps unsurprising we haven't got detailed information about it at the moment. So that's where we are. We're a little further down the road, but not quite at the destination yet. If you're an MHR customer, keep an eye on the knowledge article on the customer portal, as this will be updated to keep you informed of developments, including software which becomes available. I'll also post a link to the government policy paper, as this contains details such as employer eligibility criteria, which I've not covered here but might be of interest to some of you. And that's where we are, Stuart.
Okay, thanks for that, Neil, and the update. And as always, everyone, as more information does become available or the rules change again, we will keep you updated. So keep an eye out for our next podcast coming soon. So goodbye for today, and thank you for listening.